One of the questions that comes up over and over again in the wisdom literature is, where is God in the midst of suffering? We have the book of Proverbs laying out for us a vision for life in which, if we live in harmony with the wisdom that is woven into God's creation, we'll be blessed for it. We'll live better lives. We'll find God's rewards in this life. And if we live wicked lives, if we push away wisdom and pursue folly, we'll suffer the consequences of that. But then, as we've said in our lectures on the wisdom literature so far, that gets tested. Job is an example of someone who lived rightly and suffered nonetheless. He's the exception to the rule. The book of Ecclesiastes muses over the fact that we can't quite figure out the algorithm of life. It's always beyond our reach. And we can pursue things in this life that seem wise or helpful or healthy and still feel like life is fleeting. And in the end, we're all going to die. So the question becomes, where do we place suffering in the reality of our existence? How do we view it? If a wise life doesn't help us to avoid it, then what benefit is wisdom in the midst of suffering? If God has created the world with wisdom and order, especially, why do the righteous suffer? Why does life so often seem to contradict the moral logic that Proverbs laid out for us? I've told you in these lectures that Israel's wisdom tradition rests upon a profound confidence that creation is ordered by God. Proverbs assumes that diligence ordinarily produces prosperity, and honesty creates trust, and humility leads to honor, justice strengthens community, all of these good things. And it's not a naive vision. It's rooted in centuries of observation. It reflects the conviction that the Creator has woven moral significance into the fabric of reality. But every thoughtful person eventually encounters experiences that refuse to fit into this pattern. Good people receive devastating medical diagnoses. Honest businesses fail while dishonest ones flourish. Children die. Tyrants live into old age, surrounded by wealth and admiration, while humble people live limited lives. Anyone who pays attention to history, or simply the lives of your next-door neighbors, discovers that experience raises questions, which simple formulas cannot answer. The remarkable feature of Israel's wisdom literature is not that it provides easy answers to these questions. Its greatness lies in its willingness to ask them. Rather than silencing our doubts, the scriptures here preserve them. It doesn't hide our confusion. It gives our confusion a voice, just like the Psalms give voice to so many different human emotions. Two books stand at the center of this conversation, and those are Job and Ecclesiastes. Together, they prevent wisdom from becoming a mechanical system of rewards and punishments in which you can figure out the algorithm. Many readers misunderstand Proverbs because they read its sayings as unconditional promises. Look at Proverbs 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go. Countless parents have treated this as a divine guarantee. But Proverbs was never intended to function as a book of guarantees. Its sayings are observations about the ordinary patterns of life. They describe what generally happens in God's ordered world, but they are not contractual promises that eliminate every exception. And that's what we see in Job. The opening chapters of Job establish the problem with startling efficiency. Job is introduced as blameless and upright. And the narrator removes every possibility that the suffering is the consequence of some hidden wickedness, even as his friends accuse him of it. Before readers ever hear Job speak, they know that his suffering cannot be explained by personal sin. The friends, so-called friends, who gathered around to supposedly comfort Job, represent an old and deeply attractive theology. They assume God's justice must always be immediately visible. If suffering has arrived, wrongdoing must have perceived it. Eliphaz, remember, expresses the principle succinctly. Who that was innocent ever perished? It's a question that sounds persuasive because it rests on a belief in divine justice. But throughout the dialogues that follow, the reader gradually discovers that a true premise has been transformed into a false certainty. One scholar, Christopher Seitz, has observed that speeches of Job's friends contain many theological statements that are, taken individually, perfectly orthodox. They say that God is just, God opposes evil, God governs creation wisely. And none of those are rejected by the book of Job. Those are all upheld. The failure lies elsewhere. They assume that finite human beings possess sufficient knowledge to explain every instance of suffering, and so their confidence exceeds their understanding. This raises an important distinction between knowing that God is just and knowing exactly how God's justice is working in every circumstance. Scripture consistently affirms the first claim while repeatedly challenging the second. Another famed Old Testament commentator, Walter Brueggemann, has argued that Job preserves Israel from reducing faith to predictable formulas. Genuine faith cannot survive merely by repeating inherited answers. It must sometimes continue trusting God after familiar explanations have collapsed. That insight helps explain why Job has remained one of the most enduring books in world literature. Every generation eventually discovers that life presents experiences no simple theology can contain. The climax of Job often surprises modern readers. After dozens of chapters filled with debate, God finally speaks from the whirlwind. But God never answers the questions that dominated the book. He never goes back and explains how he and Satan made a deal in heaven. He never reveals that heavenly counsel. Instead, God asks the questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Can you bind the chains of Pleiades? These questions are invitations to perspective. Job has demanded an explanation that would require knowledge of the entire universe. And God's response reminds him that no human occupies that vantage point. Gerhard von Rad suggested that Israel's wisdom tradition ultimately discovers that wisdom belongs fully only to God. Human wisdom is always derivative. We participate in it, but we never possess it. The speeches from the whirlwind dramatize precisely this point. Creation is immeasurably larger than human perception. This is where Job and Proverbs meet. Proverbs teaches that creation possesses order, and Job teaches that the Creator's wisdom exceeds the creature's understanding, and those are complementary truths. Ecclesiastes then presses this insight in another direction. Where Job examines catastrophic suffering, Ecclesiastes examines ordinary existence. The teacher notices the relentless cycles of life. Generations come and go, the sun rises and sets, human achievement fades, and death claims both the wise and the foolish. Again and again, he reaches the conclusion that life cannot be mastered through human effort. We talked about the famous Hebrew word hevel, traditionally translated vanity. And we should pay attention to this word because it refers literally to breath or vapor. The teacher insists that life is elusive. It can't be grasped or controlled, like mist. It appears before us and then refuses to remain in our hands. Michael V. Fox argues that the image of vapor captures the teacher's deepest concern. Human beings constantly imagine they possess greater control over life than we actually do. Wisdom begins when we give up that illusion. This insight speaks with remarkable relevance to our modern American culture. Modern technology has expanded our power and we can communicate across continents in seconds. We perform surgeries that earlier generations would have considered miraculous. We can even predict hurricanes. Yet none of these achievements abolish mortality. None of them guarantee happiness. We still suffer. Ecclesiastes wants to remind us that increased knowledge is not identical with ultimate wisdom. Abraham Heschel, the great rabbi, once wrote that wisdom begins in wonder. Wonder recognizes that reality continually exceeds our expectations. It fuses to reduce creation to a problem that can simply be solved. Heschel wrote from a different context than Job or Ecclesiastes, but his insights capture something essential about both books. They invite humility in front of the mystery. For Christians, these themes converge in the person of Jesus. The Gospels never present Jesus as someone untouched by suffering. Instead, he enters fully into the brokenness of the human condition. He does things like weep at a funeral. He experiences abandonment in Gethsemane. He cries from the cross using the words of Psalm 22. The New Testament never suggests that wisdom eliminates suffering. It presents divine wisdom as remaining faithful within suffering and overcoming it only through the resurrection. Paul's declaration that Christ is the wisdom of God becomes especially significant because divine wisdom is revealed not through philosophical abstraction, but through self-giving love. The cross appears foolish to ordinary human calculations, but Paul insists that it manifests the deepest wisdom of God. The God who answered Job from the whirlwind ultimately answers the world through the cross. Job and Ecclesiastes therefore leave us with a mature vision of faith. They don't abandon confidence in God's goodness in the midst of suffering. They teach that reverence instead of certainty and trust instead of control is what God is looking for. The wisdom tradition began by inviting us to observe the order of creation. And now it teaches us to remain faithful when that order becomes difficult to discern. That movement is wisdom reaching its fullest maturity. A person who never wrestled with suffering may possess knowledge. A person who wrestled with suffering while continuing to trust God possesses something deeper. And the scriptures call that wisdom. God bless your studies.